Back out of the archives for this weekend. In 2019, back in the bad old days of ChinaEconTalk, I did a show with Doug Irwin where we did a tour through 250 years of American trade policy. It holds up really well and provides some interesting historical context on what Biden decided to do around tariffs this week. Hope you enjoy.
In Federalist 10, James Madison, who holds a special place in my heart because I've acted him on stage, once wrote that, "It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust clashing economic interests and render them all subservient to the public good." And boy, was he right. Over American history, trade policy stands out as a field of fierce political combat. So what are the principles that drive American trade policy, and what lessons from history can we draw on to understand today's trade fights? To discuss, we have on today Dartmouth professor Doug Irwin, author of the 700-page history of American trade policy from independence to the present day. Doug, welcome to ChinaEconTalk.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you mentioned in your acknowledgments that you thank your wife for putting up with your interest in such an arcane field of economics. So maybe first off, when you guys were dating or at some point, you probably gave her a pitch as to why you actually care about trade policy and why it's interesting. Maybe talk a little bit about perhaps how that pitch has changed over the course of your career.
Well, there's the personal level and then there's the professional level, I guess. So I guess the secret is in terms of my relationship with my wife. I married an economist. So it didn't take all that much for her to be persuaded that trade is...
It's cheating, man.
It is cheating a bit, yeah. We have a lot to talk about. She is a macroeconomist, however, and she doesn't really think micro is all that important or interesting. But even she, I think, today grudgingly would admit that trade policy is important. And what's sort of amazing about the present era is that with President Trump and all the headlines about trade, one really doesn't have to motivate the idea that trade policy is important and interesting for the world economy. But actually, if you go back 10 years ago or so, that wasn't the case. There was a period in my career when trade policy was sort of a sleepy backwater of economic. Tariffs were low and stable. Countries weren't using trade policy to achieve any sort of particular objective. The world seemed to be moving in a liberalizing direction, and there wasn't much to say. And now we have all these trade policy experiments with tariffs going up on China and on steel and other things. Economists are writing tons of paper on these things. Obviously, it's making the front page news above the fold even in terms of some of the macroeconomic impacts of these tariffs. So it's sort of, disheartening in a way, but also if for a trade economist, these are really interesting times.
Just from a drama perspective, how would you compare this to fights over monetary policy throughout history?
Well, there's be another great book to be written about sort of the politics of monetary policy from the very beginning. I'd say we're at a sort of a local peak in terms of interest and dissension over trade policy in terms of what the President Trump has been doing. Now, as you know, with the book, I cover, more than 200 years of U.S. history. And there was this period in the late 1820s when literally the U.S. was threatening to sort of break apart over the issue of tariff policy, objected to the high tariffs that were being imposed because the North sort of controlled the political process. So I don't think we're at the stage of breaking up the United States over trade policy, but it's pretty intense at the moment in terms of the debates going on about trade policy.
I imagine that was one of your favorite sections to write, but I'm curious where, how you made it through the entire sweep. Were there some low points as well as high points?
Yeah, I guess the thing is I didn't set out to write this book or anything. It's not like I had this conception, 10, 15 years ago, I want to write a book from the very beginning to the very end of trade policy and just tell the whole story. I sort of backed into it. I started writing papers on trade policy in the Great Depression, and I found it very interesting. It was a lot of fun, and not too many people were working in that area at the time. And so I said, well, let me go back a little bit further in time. How did we get to the Great Depression period? And slowly I sort of moved backward and forward from the 1930s. And after a few years, realized that I had sort of covered some of the big events in terms of the history of trade policy, and maybe I should put it all together in a book and cover in some of the gaps and fill in some of the holes. So I sort of, once again, it sort of came about, I wouldn't say accidentally, but sort of a haphazard way when I ultimately decided to write the book. And of course, some periods are more interesting than others. The late 19th century, from say after the Civil War up to World War I, it's a pretty stable period. There are a lot of forgettable presidents, a lot of gnashing about trade policy, but not a lot of action, a lot of sort of status quo bias, if you will.
But there's a cross of gold.
Oh, that's true. Yes. More monetary policy than trade policy per se, but they're related to some extent. Let's see. So that was sort of one of the, I guess, more slower periods. But it's also a very interesting period, not so much because of the trade politics of the period, but because of the debates over what the impact of trade policy was in terms of fostering U.S. economic growth and industrialization. So that's really the big debate in the late 19th century, not so much big fights over whether tariffs should go up or down a little bit.
I still want to go even further back. So let's start quickly the dynamics of pre-Civil War trade policy and why you argued that it's dominated of concerns around revenue raising.
Right. So actually, you're sort of asking what were the more interesting and less interesting parts of the book. I think the earlier parts are really interesting because one of the things I learned is that one of the major reasons why we have the U.S. Constitution, one of the motivations for having the Constitutional Convention was to solve a policy problem of trade policy. That is, when we got our independence, we had the Articles of Confederation, which didn't endow the National Congress with the power to tax anything. And yet the federal government or the national government need to spend money on defense and on paying foreign debts and what have you. Constitutional Convention was sort of to solve that problem of giving the government the power to tax. And by sort of unanimous consensus, the idea was, well, we're not going to have income taxes. We're not going to have sales taxes. You might have heard of the Whiskey Rebellion. Sales taxes didn't work out so well. They were resisted by the American public. But import tariffs are sort of this anonymous way of taxing goods as they came into the U.S. economy. And we're, I wouldn't say dependent on trade, but we relied on trade quite a bit. We import a lot of goods that we couldn't produce here. They came into, half a dozen or a dozen ports on the East Coast, so that's sort of easily taxed. The tax is embedded in the price of the product that the consumer pays. And so everyone sort of agreed that to raise revenue for the federal government, import tariffs are going to be the way to do it. And so with the Constitution, it's sort of, and the first debates over what we want to achieve with our trade policy, the U.S. is sort of starting out on its own as an independent country in terms of thinking about what its trade policy ought to be and what principles ought to be underlying it.
So how is this history relevant today?
Well, you would think that it wouldn't be so much, but it is in two senses, very much directly to the debates that the Trump administration has unleashed. First of all, under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, I believe, Congress is empowered with the authority to levy taxes on imports. What's happened in the late 20th century is Congress delegated a lot of those powers to the president. Now the President Trump, has really seized upon this to impose and justify the imposition of tariffs that he's done without Congress's consent. And so there is a discussion today, at least, about the role of Congress in trade policy and the Constitution. So that's how one way in which it's played in to debates today. The other is that, after the introduction of the income tax in 1913, the share of federal government revenue coming from the tariff just plummeted to, trivial amounts. I think maybe 1% or less than 1% of U.S. government revenue today comes from the tariff. But one of the selling points that the president has sort of made in talking about his tariffs is that they're raising a lot of revenue. So he tweets a lot about how our coffers are being filled with millions, if not billions of dollars from that other countries are paying for the privilege of sending their goods to the U.S. And so he's sort of raised revenue as a reason or a justification for imposing tariffs today. And so that idea of revenue has come back into play as well. I mean, one of the things that I've sort of got about in terms of looking at more than 200 years of U.S. trade policy history is that there's a lot of recycling of arguments, a lot of reinventing the wheel, a lot of debates that take place today that took place, 50, 100, 200 years ago. So there are some really underlying themes and issues that come up with trade policy that just are sort of always present with us.
Sure. Trump certainly taking cues from mercantilist British Empire-inspired economics. Let's now turn to the restriction phase, which you argue was the first fundamental shift in U.S. policy. Right.
So one of the themes of the book, I guess two themes of the book that I'll sort of highlight to sort of introduce this topic is that when we ask what is the motivation or what is the goal or what is the federal government trying to achieve in levying tariffs on imports, I have what I call the 3 R's: revenue, restriction, and reciprocity. So revenue is the idea is that if we tax foreign imports, that raises money for the federal government. Pretty straightforward. The second one, restriction, is, well, we are imposing tariffs on imports not so much for revenue, but we just want to keep those imports out to restrict those imports so that we create jobs in import competing industries and strengthen the American economy. So obviously that argument has been very potent and has been around for a long time. And the Trump administration also points to that, saying we're helping rise the steel industry, et cetera. And one hears that in past decades as well. Then the last one, reciprocity, which we'll get to a little bit later, is that you're imposing tariffs or you're using your trade policy to negotiate with other countries to reduce their barriers. And so you reach these agreements to reduce trade barriers and increase bilateral trade or multilateral trade, as the case may be. So you mentioned the transition from revenue to restriction. So this took place in the 1860s. And here's where sort of one of the second themes of the book is that when we're trying to determine what phase we're in, revenue, restriction, or reciprocity, or we're trying to determine who's really calling the shots in terms of trade policy, it comes down to regional politics and which regions of the country either benefit from trade or benefit from trade barriers, and which regions of the country have the most political power in the Congress and in the federal government. And so the reason why in the 1860s we shifted from revenue to reciprocity is that prior to the Civil War, the South was politically dominant in the United States. Not at all times, but they were very powerful, particularly in the Senate. And the South, that's the region of the country that was responsible for most of the U.S. exports at the time. Cotton, in particular, was a big one, but also tobacco, indigo, and some other commodities as well. And so if the South is sort of most politically powerful and they get to dictate to the nation what trade policies will be of the United States, they're going to be relatively open. They want relatively low tariffs to keep exports up. So what happens with the Civil War, it's a reorientation or a redirection of political power in the United States, a realignment of political power in the United States. That's when the North really becomes dominant, not just because the South stepped out of Congress when they tried to secede during the Civil War, but after the war, when the South came back in, they were much less politically powerful than they had been. So the North, that's where import-competing manufacturing industries had arisen in the first half of the 19th century. And so they wanted trade restriction. They wanted restriction as U.S. trade policy. And so they used their political power from 1860 up till World War I and after to establish high tariffs as sort of the trade policy regime of the United States.
Doug, talk a little bit about log rolling. So what was it and what sort of impact did it have on U.S. trade policy?
So log rolling is a political science term for talking about how votes take place in Congress. And political scientists and economists have used it to sort of talk about how this regime of high tariffs got maintained in place in Congress for so many years in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So basically it relies on vote trading among members of Congress to keep tariffs high. So let's say you're from the state of Florida. Now, Florida doesn't produce steel, but Pennsylvania does. And so the senators and representatives in Pennsylvania really want high tariffs on imported steel. But most states don't produce steel. So why would Congress ever vote for high prices or high tariffs on steel? Well, members of the Florida delegation, they care about sugar. They want to keep out sugar imports. And maybe in North Carolina, or West Virginia, say there's coal, and they want to keep out coal. So various states' delegations will sort of get together and say, I'll vote for your steel tariff if you vote for my sugar tariff. And so that this vote trading, known as log rolling, sort of gives rise to interlocking coalition that makes it very difficult to push for lower tariffs. Because while most states might like lower tariffs on steel, they don't want lower tariffs on their own goods. And they've collaborated or gotten together to keep these tariffs high. So one reason why in the late 19th century, even when the Democrats, who came largely from the South, had almost zero success in reducing tariffs in the late 19th century or early 20th century, is that they just had to face these log rolling coalitions in Congress that are very, very difficult to defeat.
My favorite part about trade history is we're not just talking about the big, steel, indigo, tobacco types of goods. We're also going way down into the weeds. We've got bird cages, we've got fur hats, we've got crayons. It just keeps going and going because the interests are extraordinarily local, and you can, have individual line items for all these different types of goods.
Yeah. So when Congress, throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century, whenever they considered a tariff bill, It consisted of, I think, up to 3,000 lines by the 1930s, individual tariff lines on individual products. And behind each of those products, there's some producers located in some states who are going to let their representatives and senators know that they really value those high tariffs. And so you get members of Congress defending and debating the clothespin tariff, the tomato tariff, the felt skirt tariff. And by the time, of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, it was taking weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months, in fact, to get through the Senate, where they would literally have roll call votes on each of these individual tariff lines, sometimes more than once. So it does get into the nitty gritty.
I love how you have some quotes from senators and representatives talking about how basically this is the worst part of their job, and they were happy to end up seeing it go just so they could spend time doing other things. So you mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Let's please.
No, I was just going to add that's one reason why Congress ultimately decided to delegate tariff authority to the president, is that they didn't want to deal with the tomato tariff and the clothespin tariff. It was just taking up an enormous amount of legislative time. And of course, Washington would be besieged by special interest groups whenever Congress decided to take up the tariff. And so they said, we have much more interesting and important issues to deal with than fighting these sort of micro battles over this and that. We're just going to deal with, give this to the president in some sense.
Sure. So before we get to that, you mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, perhaps the most famous tariffs in world history. So what were they, and why did folks think they were a good idea at the time?
Yeah, so the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed by Congress in June of 1930, and then signed by President Hoover. And it's been infamous because, first of all, I think the name is sort of slick, Smoot-Hawley. It's not a regular term. It sort of has a nice, cadence to it. It sort of was a very ill-timed tariff in the sense that it occurred right as the world economy was slipping into the Great Depression. Now, when it was originally proposed in the late 1920s, the U.S. economy was doing very well. We were close to full employment. The stock market was booming. Industrial production was growing. The economy seemed to be doing well. But it was introduced in Congress in 1928, 1929, and the idea behind it was, well, the farm sector is lagging, and the farm sector isn't doing so well. There were dislocations coming as a result of World War I and overproduction and overinvestment in land. And so we have to help farmers cope with imports. We have to raise their prices in some way. In fact, Congress had twice passed price supports. In the late 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge vetoed both of those pieces of legislation. So in other words, Congress was groping for some way to help out rural America, some way to help out farmers. Price support seemed to be the obvious way of doing it, but the president didn't want that. And so they said, well, maybe the tariff is sort of the second best way of dealing with the issue. Even though I go through the book, it really wouldn't have helped out farmers that much because most big farmers were big exporters, not facing foreign competition, not facing imports. But here's where the term log rolling comes in as well. Even though it was motivated originally to help out the farm sector and agriculture, once you start talking about the tariff in Congress, then the fishbowl industry and the tomato producers and steel producers, they start coming out of the woodwork and saying, well, if you're going to raise those tariffs, you might as well raise ours too. We could always benefit from capturing a little bit more market share by keeping out foreign competition. And so by the time it sort of passed, it was an almost across-the-board tariff increase. The U.S. had the stock market crash in late 1929, so the world economy was becoming increasingly fragile. Congress really didn't think about foreign ramifications in terms of foreign retaliation. And so what ultimately happened is that other countries did retaliate against the U.S. That hurt our exports. World trade began to contract. That exacerbated the Great Depression, which we had already sort of begun to slide into. And it just became sort of this trade policy disaster that the U.S. spent about really 20 or 30 years trying to pull our way out of this. It wasn't just that other countries raised their tariffs against our products, it's they also formed these trade blocs that discriminated against the U.S. In particular, the British Imperial Preference Scheme, which included Britain, Canada, and others, which were big markets for U.S. produce. Now the U.S. faced not just higher tariffs, but discriminatory tariffs in those markets. So Smoot-Hawley, it was really sort of this unnecessary, unwise piece of legislation, very ill-timed. and created big problems for a long time for U.S. trade policy.
Interestingly, you have a quote in your new foreign affairs piece talking about U.S.-China trade relations, and there's a quote from Navarro saying, "Man, there's no way these guys are going to retaliate. We're the biggest importer in the world. Everyone's going to want to keep selling stuff to us." Little did he know, had he read your book and understood the reactions of the Smoot-Hawley in the Smoot-Hawley period, perhaps he would have thought a little harder about the international reaction.
There's actually absolutely a parallel there because Congress, some Democrats in Congress said, well, we ought to really think about this carefully and not just think about domestic interests, but our export interests, and other countries might retaliate. And basically the reaction of most members of Congress, Republicans at the time, was, nah, we don't have to worry about that. Other countries, this is a domestic piece of legislation. It doesn't really concern other countries. They're not going to retaliate. And of course, they did. So that seems to be one theme, is that some policymakers or trade policy thinkers will sort of understate or underplay the idea that other countries will retaliate against us.
Yeah, I mean, it's 1930. Who's reading the telegrams? It comes in a few days late. Something else will come through the wire.
Sometimes these groups are called economic nationalists. So that's what Peter Navarro might call himself. But what they don't realize that they're economic nationalists in other countries too. So, if we aggrieve other countries, hurt their exports, they don't just say, oh, well, I guess there's nothing we can do about that. They get upset too, and they're nationalists, and so they say we have to strike back against the Americans who cut out our markets. And the reason why the Europeans were particularly concerned about this at the time, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, is they were trying to repay their war debts to the United States as a result of World War I. So they need to run trade surpluses with the U.S., and their ability to do so was hurt by the tariffs that we imposed. And so there was this financial dimension too to what was going on at that time.
All right, so FDR comes in and the whole trajectory starts to shift. Why does this happen?
Yeah, so here's another one of these trade policy pivot points, one could call them. So the first one we talked about was the shift from revenue to restriction with the Civil War and the realignment in American politics, shifting political power to the North. Well, we have in the 1932 election another political realignment towards the Democrats, shifting a little bit more towards the South, although FDR's coalition also included big parts of the urban areas in the North. But it was much more, the political party of the Democrats at the time was much more in favor of freer trade. That's where the Democrats in the South, once again, were still sort of representing export-oriented industries. Urban areas were, wanted cheap imports for food and other things. And so the political system sort of shifted back towards freer trade, but it wasn't a shift towards just abolishing Smoot-Hawley. So in the past, when the Democrats had taken over, the few times in the late 19th century, they tried to pass bills just reducing tariffs. So the Republicans would try to push tariffs up, the Democrats would try to push them down. But what the FDR realized at the time was, first of all, we're in a depression. A unilateral tariff reduction is not going to work well politically, and it's not even going to help us out that much economically, because what's happened as a result of Smoot-Hawley is other countries have raised their tariffs against us. They've retaliated against us. And so we have to get rid of that discrimination. We have to get rid of those foreign tariffs. So the way we're going to do so is we're going to bargain. We're going to say, we will reduce our tariffs on your goods if you reduce your tariffs on our goods and get rid of the discrimination. And so that's why FDR didn't say we're going to just slash or unilaterally cut tariffs. We're going to start bargaining. And that's this introduction of this last or third phase of U.S. trade policy, the third R, if you will, reciprocity, where we're going to negotiate with other countries. And so the Roosevelt administration pushed for this piece of legislation in 1934 called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which empowered the president to undertake those trade negotiating activities. And that's sort of where we are. That's sort of the regime we're in today, where Congress no longer sets the tariff rates themselves. They don't pass these long, complicated tariff bills with individual tariff lines. They sort of rely on the president to handle trade policy within some circumscribed limits, of course. And so the president is really sort of the main trade policy actor today. And so that's where we've been since the 1930s.
Did you dig at all into the intellectual history of the reciprocal trade agreements, the whole idea of this? Because it does seem like very much like a change in paradigm, as opposed to just trying to plug away at these existing edifices.
Right. Certainly there was discussion in the progressive era about, Congress is slow and sort of doesn't really think about the national interest all the time, but special interests. And so we need to empower a very strong, quick acting executive. And we need these expert administrative agencies to handle our policy, whether it's the creation of the Food and Drug Administration or other agencies like that. So there was this idea that, we wanted to create this impartial, non-political tariff board that would sort of adjudicate tariff issues. That didn't work out so well. The idea had been floating around for some time that, Congress is really not the best forum in which to debate these tariff rates. We need to get it out. The phrase at the time was, take the tariff out of politics. And really, there's no way you can do so, but the idea was you want to sort of separate it from Congress. And so the idea of delegating authority to the branch of the president in particular had been floating around for some period of time.
So the RTA definitely had its detractors at the time. Some said that it was a, quote, fascist dictatorship in respect to tariffs. And another said that there are no shackles upon this use of extraordinary, tyrannical, dictatorial power over the life and death of the American economy. Also, there was an American Tariff League that was pushing back against this. What does the pushback say about the politics of the time?
Well, I think there's another parallel to what we see going on today, is that both parties, we don't point fingers at anyone in particular, but at the time, and these were the Republicans who were opposing this, they just grope for any argument they can have to object to something. If a Republican president had said, I need these tariff powers. In fact, Hoover got some tariff powers in the Smoot-Hawley Act. Republicans would have been fine with that. But the problem was not so much that they were complaining that we're delegating powers to the president. It's that they knew that the President Roosevelt, would use that power to reduce tariffs. And they cared about the outcome. So they were objecting to the outcome, that tariffs would go down as a result of this delegation. And this is something, we see today when some of the political parties say, we oppose this measure because it's sort of unconstitutional, or it's a bad policy framework. They're really objecting to the outcomes that they see in giving a certain administration certain powers. But the reason they lost is quite...
So
they didn't have the votes in Congress. They were a minority party. So they could scream all they wanted to, but they have no impact really on how events played out.
So this American Tariff League, when did they die out? And is Trump going to bring them back?
Could be. I still see references to them in the 1950s and maybe even the early 1960s. But by that time, by the 1950s and 60s, trade policy, or at least trade, was not a big part of the U.S. economy. Japan and Western Europe were sort of devastated as a result of World War II. We really didn't face a lot of import competition. And so the need for an American Tariff League was pretty small at that time. There are no major industries that were complaining about imports. So whether they come back or not, we'll see. Big difference, of course, between that period in the 1930s, when there was the American Tariff League that was politically, pretty robust, and today is that back then, businesses were not really globalized. They were national businesses. So there were foreign producers and domestic producers, and the domestic producers wanted to keep the foreign producers out. Today, American business is really globalized. Most large companies are multinational. They're operating in many countries at the same time. They're sourcing components, if they're in manufacturing, from many different places. And so I think that we won't see a revival of the American Tariff League because most businesses today are globally integrated, and they rely on imported components. And so they don't want the old-fashioned protectionism that we saw in the 1930s and before.
So you're saying if I don't do it, no one will?
I think there's an opening for you. Give it a shot.
Okay, that or a dissertation on what they were up to in the 1950s. We'll see. We'll see which road I go down.
Yeah.
So, Secretary Hull, who was he, and how big a role did he play in changing trade policy at the time?
So, Cordell Hull was Secretary of State from 1933 to 1944, and he's sort of one of the people that I think most kids and students of American history don't either know about or appreciate his role in terms of U.S. trade policy.
Great character, though. He comes from the middle of nowhere in Tennessee. He's this hillbilly who barely went to college, ends up becoming Secretary of State during World War II. I mean, rags to riches if you ever wanted one.
Yeah, and he really had played an outsized role in terms of redirecting U.S. trade policy in the 1930s. And, at the time he was made fun of. It was thought that, that trade policy was really not very important during the Great Depression, and that this goal of achieving all these reciprocal trade agreements he's just not going to achieve it. The rest of the world doesn't want them. It's sort of, he's wasting his time. But he, was very persistent. He was very focused on this one goal of using the State Department to try to get more economic peace and harmony through peaceful trade relations. And, he retired or resigned as Secretary of State in 1944. He was America's longest serving Secretary of State. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945, both for his work on the United Nations, helping to create the United Nations, as well as his work on trade policy. So he's a really big figure that's a little bit forgotten these days, but he really did change the course of U.S. trade policy. And the impact of his ideas really came to the fore in the 1940s and 50s after he left office with the formation of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which we now know of as the World Trade Organization. So he really pushed for multilateral trade policies that came about after he had stepped down from office. But he's a big figure in the history of U.S. trade policy.
Yeah, there's a sort of tragic aspect of his story as well, because his whole theory of the case was that trade between countries helps bring about peace. One of the decisions that he partially signed off to was the blockade of Japan in 1940 of restricting them from being able to import oil. And, we don't need to entirely adjudicate why Pearl Harbor happened, but this was certainly one of the causes of Japan's calculation that they needed to act, was because of the power that the U.S. international trade had on their economy.
Right. And I think his deputy, Dean Acheson at the time, played a role in that as well. But he was generally considered to be a pretty weak Secretary of State. That's largely because FDR wanted to be his own, run foreign policy out of the White House. But I still think he's a bit underrated, particularly in the trade field, where he was really of critical importance.
All right, so let's get through World War II. So GATT, what is it and why does it matter?
Well, as we were sort of just talking about, we had this piece of legislation, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, passed in 1934. It really didn't achieve much in the 1930s. We already had sort of fascist Germany and fascist Japan that didn't want to sign trade agreements. Britain had gone in for imperial preferences with Canada and its former colonies. So it was a tough row to hoe for Hull during the 1930s, and he really didn't achieve much. But he had this idea that, we should bring countries together and reduce trade barriers, and really didn't sort of come to fruition until after World War II. That's when the U.S. really, was the dominant power politically, militarily, and economically in the world. Britain was much weaker. And so the U.S. Couldn't really dictate terms, but really could set the agenda for where the world economy, at least arrangements relevant to the world economy, were going after World War II. And so the State Department said, we want to have a big convention after the war to handle international monetary arrangements. And that's what the Bretton Woods Agreement was in 1944 that set up the IMF and the World Bank. And we also want a big agreement on trade. And that was first set up in 1947 at a conference in Geneva that set out an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which sort of set the framework for post-war trade relations. The State Department actually wanted to do something even bigger and create something called the ITO, the International Trade Organization. And there was a conference in Havana in 1948, but it was never approved by Congress, and that effort failed. It would have been a great place, I'm sure, great nightclubs and great music, but the issues, of course, were political. The fact that so many countries had so many divergent trade interests just really couldn't come to an agreement around the table. Whereas the nice thing about the GATT was it was basically the U.S. and Western Europe and a few other countries that really wanted to focus on trade liberalization. And so they came up with this agreement for most favored nation status and other rules for trade, as well as exchanging some tariff reductions in the bargaining process. And so the GATT process really moved forward, whereas the multilateral effort failed at that time.
Trade or fade, one of the slogans for the time, which I think someone should bring back nowadays.
I think that was Eisenhower or someone in the Eisenhower administration. But what the GATT process did is not just reduce tariffs all at once. There was that first agreement in 1947, but there were sort of a series of trade negotiating rounds about every decade. So there was the Kennedy round of the 1960s, which put a further dent into tariffs. The Tokyo round of the 1970s, which sort of ratcheted tariffs down again. And then the Uruguay round of the 1980s and 90s, which did a lot of things, but also ratcheted tariffs down. So it was a sort of this slow process over time of reducing trade barriers and trying to constrain trade policy around the world.
All right, let's now get to the next big piece of legislation, the Trade Act of 1974. What were the circumstances under its passing, and what did it accomplish?
Yeah, it did a couple of things. Not as big as the RTAA in 1934, but first of all, it renewed the president's ability to negotiate trade agreements, and that's authority that has to be renewed every now and then. The president just can't, the president could always negotiate, but Congress may not like that. So it was necessary for us to go into the Tokyo round to have that legislation. It also introduced something called fast track, which is another thing we're still living with today, not just trade negotiating authority. So what fast track is that the first trade agreements in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s were just tariff cutting exercises that didn't need to go back to Congress to get approval. But by the time we're in the 1970s, tariff levels had come down a bit, quite a bit. Trade negotiations were dealing with increasingly non-tariff barriers.
So what are non-tariff barriers?
So non-tariff barriers would be government regulations or quotas or things that are obstructing trade that are not, strictly speaking, tariffs. And if you're going to regulate those or restrict their use, that requires changes in domestic legislation. And so the problem is that if the president negotiated some agreement brought towards Congress, Congress would, just like they did with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, want to put its fingers in the pie, so to speak, and to start changing this provision here and modifying that one there. And then you'd have to bring that back to the International Negotiating Forum. They might not like that. So if Congress got to sort of second guess or change whatever the president had negotiated, it would be a very laborious process that just you'd never get anywhere, really. And so what Congress did is said, in fast track in the Trade Act of 1974 is that if you bring us an agreement that we've authorized you to reach, we will pledge to do two things. One is just to get an up or down vote in Congress, in the House and the Senate, and therefore change domestic legislation as a result. So we won't try to change the provisions per se. We'll just give it an up or down vote, but we do have that right to veto it. And we'll do it within a reasonable amount of time. So we just won't sit on it and let it sort of die a long death. And so that's what fast track is, and that's something that's still an issue whenever a president wants to reach a foreign trade agreement. So that's sort of what we're dealing with now with the renegotiation of NAFTA, the USMCA. I think it's been formally submitted to Congress, but they have this timetable that they have to agree to approve it without changing any of the provisions.
So I'd like to drill down pretty deep on the Reagan era because, he probably had the most intense, aggressive protectionist measures we've seen in modern American history. So what drove an administration filled up with dyed-in-the-wool Republicans whose staff were chock full of Milton Friedman devotees to drop some really, really hard trade measures?
Well, you have to remember that just about every administration is divided. And so it wasn't just Milton Friedman devotees and free market advocates, but they're also business people. And business people tend to, like tariffs for at least on their business. And here there's a big analogy with the Trump administration. So there's been this division in the Trump administration as well, where at least early on, there were Larry Kudlow and Gary Cohn, sort of free market types that wanted free trade. And then the business people like Wilbur Ross, who wanted to, have tariffs to defend American industry against foreign competition. So every administration is divided between different factions. There's usually not just a monolith. But what was going on in the Reagan administration is, yes, the president spoke in favor of free trade, and he seemed to support that, but he also negotiated export restrictions on automobiles with Japan and imposed steel voluntary restraint agreements and things of that sort. And I'd say the reason is that we had the worst recession since the Great Depression in the early 1980s. As a result, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker tightening monetary policy to reduce the rate of inflation. And that recession was accompanied by a very strong U.S. dollar that led to a large trade deficit. And so a lot of import competing industries were being hurt. There was a lot of unemployment at the time, both because of monetary policy and to some extent because of structural changes in manufacturing. And so it was a way of sort of using trade restraints to sort of limit the damage during this tricky time in U.S. economic history. So it's a little bit different than the Trump administration today, which is also giving the Reagan administration a run for its money in terms of the number of protectionist measures. Today, the U.S. economy so far has been pretty strong. We have very low unemployment rates, but Reagan was dealing with unemployment rates over 10%. Intellectually, he was in favor of free trade, but politically, he was flexible enough to have temporary measures, and most of these things did go away with time, temporary measures to try to offset some of the hurt caused by the tight monetary policies at the time.
I love how you tell this story about a series of events which leads to enormous sugar tariffs, so high such that folks ended up bringing sugar in through Canada by means of cake mix, packets of iced tea, and then cooking them down and selling it as raw sugar. And this whole rigmarole was actually profitable.
Yes, so we had these import quotas on sugar that drove up the domestic price of sugar to 2 or 3 times the world price. And so cake mixes, you get these imports of fake cake mixes, which are 95% sugar, and then they just take the flour out once it came into the U.S. and sold the sugar at the higher price. There was even a case where I think we were banning imports of Israeli frozen pizzas because the sugar content was too high and some firms were extracting the sugar to sold at the higher price. What this shows you too is there's a limit to trade policy in the sense that you can raise tariffs on certain goods, but there's always an incentive, if not to smuggle, at least to try to get around those tariffs. There's something called tariff engineering, where you change the type of product that you're sending into the U.S. just to avoid the tariff.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of tariff engineering, it's going on nowadays as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's just an article on Columbia, the clothing company, and how they would adjust how many buttons or how many pockets they have on some of their shirts, so that the tariffs would apply to one category of goods, not another. There's this big debate a couple of years ago about whether Snuggie blankets, which you sometimes see advertised on TV, whether that's a garment or a blanket, because garments and blankets get different tax treatment on the tariff code. And I can't remember which way it was supposed to go, but the company, definitely wanted that these were manufactured in China. They wanted them under the low tariff category. I guess the best example of tariff engineering I have in the book, or at least one of my favorites, is that we imposed tariffs on imported motorcycles during the Reagan administration in the mid-1980s. And the tariffs applied to motorcycles with piston displacements of 700 cc's and above, heavyweight motorcycles. And so what Honda started doing is producing a 699 cc version. Now, the difference between a 699 cc engine and a 700 cc engine is imperceptible, but just by changing that 1 cubic centimeter, it changed the whole tariff treatment, and you avoided a 45% tariff and were assessed at a much, much lower rate.
So let's now turn to Reagan's relationship with Japan. So how did these tensions build up? The complaints you write about at the time seem pretty similar to the charges folks are levying today at China.
Yeah, very similar to what's being talked about in terms of China, but some big differences too. So we can go through some of them if I can remember them all. So the similarities are we had a big and growing trade deficit with Japan, just as we've had with China, that they were exporting a lot of goods that were hurting U.S. industries, particularly automobiles, steel, semiconductors. In the case of Japan in the 1980s, a little bit less obvious what they were in the case of China, a lot of apparel and furniture and things of that sort, but certainly some manufacturing industries have been hurt as well as a result of imports from China. And a view that they weren't fair traders in the sense that their market wasn't open for our products as our market is for theirs. So we had a big trade deficit with Japan, just as we have a big trade deficit with China. The view with Japan was also, their formal trade barriers were low, but somehow we just can't penetrate their market. It's very difficult. And the same claim is made about China that, their formal tariffs are low, but the government sort of behind the scenes with administrative guidance or other mechanisms to avoid buying U.S. products, manufactured goods in particular. So a lot of this similar things also about intellectual property. Thought that at the time Japan, didn't respect U.S. intellectual property and just stole some of our best technology. Obviously, same true with regard to China today. But the big difference is that, yes, the Reagan administration went after Japan and tried to threaten them and get them to change their policies with trade sanctions. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 sort of gives the president the authority to do this, and that's how President Trump has also gone after China. But the big difference is that the U.S. and Japan had a very good relationship. We were both democracies. We were both largely market economies. We were both military allies. Japan relied on us quite a bit. And so Japan really wanted to accommodate U.S. concerns as best they could under the circumstances. And so there's a much more amicable agreement to try to do something to reduce those trade tensions. Where with China, obviously, they're not a democracy. They're not a military ally. We're geopolitical and geostrategic rivals to some extent. China's a rising power, although we were feared Japan as a rising power back then in the 90s as well. And so the relationship is much more fraught, much more difficult. And obviously, China's a much bigger economy, too, the world's second largest economy, although I think Japan was back in the 1980s, too, but it wasn't considered quite the dominant threat as China is today. So the threats and the bullying don't work as well with China as they did with Japan, which wanted to reach an accommodation with the U.S. And as I pointed out earlier, there are economic nationalists in the United States, but there are also a lot of economic nationalists in China, too. So when the U.S. hits them with tariffs, what China does, which Japan never did in the 1980s, is say, we're going to counter-retaliate. We're going to impose tariffs on your goods. And that's exactly what China has done today. In terms of buying soybeans to buying other products as well. They've increased their tariffs on U.S. products. And so we're in this trade war with China in a way that we never really were with Japan because Japan never retaliated against the United States. And of course, the U.S.-Japan trade conflict sort of really faded by the early and mid-1990s when Japan's economy sort of began to flatline a bit. And so it really remains to be seen what the end game is with China. Because they're certainly experiencing slower growth in China, as you well know, but whether they're ever going to really back down or whether we're going to diffuse this conflict remains to be seen.
Could you talk in particular about the trade policy response to Japanese semiconductors?
Sure, that was sort of a big issue at the time, and the concern was twofold. One is that Japan. Well, let me back up just for a moment. Japan had this tendency in certain narrow product categories to ramp up its exports very, very quickly and really sort of surprise and hurt big U.S. domestic industry. So autos was a classic case of that, where imports in the late 70s, early 80s really began to skyrocket from Japan. And the same was happening with semiconductors in the mid-1980s. They were investing a lot in the production of DRAMs, dynamic random access memory chips, sort of basic memory chips in computers, and just sort of pushing the U.S. industry out of that product category. In fact, a lot of people thought that the whole U.S. high-tech sector would suffer as a result, and we wouldn't produce any semiconductors. And what happened as a result of that competition is Intel and others started producing more microprocessors and specialized chips rather than sort of the generic memory chips. What the Semiconductor Industry Association wanted was two things. One, they wanted Japan to stop what they were alleging was the dumping of chips on the world market. And second, they want to open up Japan's market to U.S.-made semiconductors. And so the trade conflict in 1985, 86, 87 sort of centered around those two issues. And there was an agreement signed in 1986 where Japan agreed to stop the dumping. Otherwise, the U.S. could impose these special tariffs. And there was a secret side letter to that agreement where Japan agreed to ensure that 20% of semiconductor purchases in Japan would be to foreign vendors. And that was secret because it was sort of a market share target. It wasn't saying that there wasn't some trade barrier preventing Japan from importing semiconductors. But it was thought that through various administrative practices, the Japanese semiconductor market really wasn't open to foreign competition. And so they set up this market share target, which was eventually hit in the early 1990s. But it was the failure to hit that target that was one of the rationales for the U.S. retaliation for noncompliance with Japan in terms of that agreement in 1987. So semiconductors was sort of not really remembered as much today in terms of the trade conflict, but it was a big issue with Japan in the late 1980s. One last thought on that, and this is something that comes up time and time again in U.S. trade policy history, is that at any given point in time, there's going to be one issue which is considered overridingly important, and all attention is focused on it. And yet as little as 5 years later, it can be completely off the radar screen of trade policy officials. So, everything's on Japan and semiconductors in 1987, but by 1992, it was basically almost a non-issue. And that tends to happen a lot. There's a lot of these fads of trade policy concerns or trade policy issues that really just die away with time.
Yeah, I mean, it's die away with time and die away with changing macroeconomic flows, right? As fear of Japan's recedes, as the real estate bubble bursts and the stock market interspersed with it, then it's not so scary anymore that Japan's semiconductors may be taking over the world.
Exactly. Yep.
So now let's come to NAFTA, which was almost not a priority for Clinton, but time and again we see the influence of sort of like elite worldly policymakers. Lloyd Benson of Jack Kennedy fame ends up talking Clinton into it. So tell that story and talk a little bit about NAFTA's pass through Congress.
Sure. Well, trade politics, one of the themes of the book is it's always partisan. There's always these parties that disagree over trade policy. And so generally, NAFTA, which had been proposed by Mexico, was supported by Republicans and George H.W. Bush, and more opposed by Democrats who were concerned about the impact on U.S. labor and things of that sort. And of course, Ross Perot, who recently passed away, ran for president in 1992 against NAFTA. So the Democrats were generally considered to be skeptical about NAFTA, but it was also considered to be very important in terms of foreign policy. Here is a sort of an economic rapprochement with Mexico, a country with whom we've had difficult relations for many, many decades. So it would be hard to sort of reject it out of hand. Clinton was a new Democrat who supported globalization and wanted to support NAFTA, but a lot of his advisors and others were much more tepid about it. So he was a bit cagey during the 1992 election campaign. But he really wanted to support it. But a lot of his aides, early on in his administration were sort of saying, this is going to divide Congress and divide your party. You really don't want to push this and you want to delay it. So they did negotiate two-side agreements on labor and the environment to sort of make it more palatable to Democrats. But it comes, as many trade policy decisions that, you have to sort of at some point make a decision. And so there was this cabinet meeting or this meeting of economic officials in the Clinton administration. And Secretary of the Treasury, Lloyd Benson, a Democrat who supported more trade with Mexico and this initiative for economic reasons and foreign policy reasons, banged his hand on the table apparently and said, we got to stand up and support this. This is the right thing to do. And that sort of got everyone's attention. He was held in high esteem by the president and other members of in the White House. That sort of pushed the decision. Yes, we're going to back this thing and we're trying to get it through Congress. And it was quite a difficult thing for a Democrat president to go against most Democrats and try to get it through Congress. But President Clinton, to his credit, did it in 1993.
It was a tough fight. Benson said, I quote, it was pretty touch and go. Lloyd Benson at one point said, I courted some of these congressmen longer than I courted my wife.
Yeah, that gets back to that point that I made before, that when you're in the executive branch and you're negotiating these trade agreements, you're really negotiating with two parties. One is the foreign countries that you're trying to deal with, but also domestic politics in Congress. And it's actually easy to come up with a trade agreement with Mexico. That wasn't a hard negotiation. The hard part was convincing members of Congress to vote for it, because trade politics is always difficult in Congress. There's going to be a lot of opponents. The people who are going to lose their jobs and the industries that are going to face foreign competition, they know that, and they're going to fight it tooth and nail. Whereas the beneficiaries, the consumers or other export industries, they're much more diffuse, widely spread, and not really politically engaged or as active as those who are going to oppose it. So it took a lot of persuasion and arm twisting to get Congress to approve NAFTA.
Yeah. Coming back to this question of, aside from it just being a regional thing, I think at least, in the age of globalists, which we can maybe start from the early 90s, it does seem like trade has a particular grasp on the imagination, and people maybe give it more weight than the economics indicate. So you mentioned this idea of national security being a key factor in American trade policy making. Maybe you want to expand on that a little more?
Sure. Well, national security has always been in the backdrop of trade policy discussions going, right back from the very beginning. One of the rationales for early tariffs and Alexander Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers in 1792 is that we need tariffs to be economically self-sufficient in certain areas, and so that we can fight wars and not depend on imported war material or what have you. So it's always been in there. It's never been a primary concern because the U.S. has never really faced big threats of invasion. But during the Cold War, after World War II, when we were engaged in this conflict with the Soviet Union, there were provisions put in U.S. trade law allowing the president to restrict imports on grounds of national security if imports were impairing an industry that was essential or deemed essential for national security. And that's something that the Trump administration sort of resurrected in the case of steel. And they've also proposed it in the case of automobiles, although they haven't proposed exactly what the measures they'd like to take. So there's it's always been a concern there. There's always been an option to subordinate national security concerns, or subordinate trade policy or open trade policies to national security concerns. But there's also this question of abuse and whether it really was the case that we need to limit imports of steel on national security grounds or not.
Speaking of other countries being upset at U.S. Trade policy, talk a little bit about the WTO. You argue that it was actually Reagan throwing around America's might using these Section 301 clauses was actually what got the world united into creating something like the WTO in the first place.
Yes, and certainly the dispute settlement system of the WTO, which is sort of the key part of it. So what was happening is that, in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, there was sort of this growth of voluntary export restraints. There's something called the multi-fiber arrangement, which is limiting trade in textiles and apparel. There's a sense that world trade rules were being sort of circumvented, and countries weren't adhering to their obligations under the GATT. And so the U.S. wanted a much greater enforcement of the rules. We're saying, if we're signing these agreements and coming up with these rules, they ought to be enforced some way. And there's no mechanism really, at least good mechanism in the GATT to do so, at least in the administration's opinion. And so they started using Section 301 to address some of these things. And other countries hated this because that was a case in which the U.S. would decide if some other country was a fair or an unfair trader. And then the U.S. would grant itself the right to impose sanctions if the country was found in violation of some some provision. And so basically other countries said we need a neutral arbiter to determine if trade rules are being adhered to or not. We have to take this away from the U.S. It can't be just for the U.S. to do this unilaterally. The U.S. could get away with it because we're a large country and other countries really dependent on our market access. But how would Costa Rica or Jamaica ever enforce its trade rights? They don't have the economic power to impose sanctions and discipline other countries and threaten them to get them to change their trade policies. And so we need some sort of independent arbitration mechanism to sort of make this come to be. And so the Europeans and others basically said, we'll create this dispute settlement system in the WTO context as long as you sort of stop using Section 301. That was the implicit quid pro quo.
So quickly, any reflections on the PNTR debate and Bush's unilateralism?
So the PNTR debate, which is permanent normalized trade relationship with China, was controversial at the time in 1999, 2000. It allowed China to enter into the WTO, but it's recently, that was a long time ago, but Congress has, the administration has really raised questions about whether that was a good thing or not, and whether we struck a hard enough deal. So there's sort of relitigating or bringing that back in terms of the debate. The reason why is, of course, is that China has become this, huge, large economic power that's created problems for American industries. And so there's obviously a big rethinking of the U.S.-China relationship, and the Trump administration thinks that we've been the loser there. And so PNTR was a bad decision at the time. A lot of the former U.S. Trade reps have come out and defended that, saying at the time, we got the best deal we could, and actually China gave a lot of concessions. But that's just part of the trade policy debate, always second guessing whether we got a good deal or not.
Coming back very quickly to Bush's unilateralism, this idea of competitive liberalization sounds good to me. It's kind of like race to the top for trade deals. So what were the issues with it that actually turned trade into a much more partisan issue than it was pre-2000s?
Yeah, so the idea of competitive liberalization, which came about, was a phrase used by Robert Zoellick, who was the trade negotiator in the George W. Bush administration. The idea was that after the Uruguay round that created the WTO, the multilateral system wasn't working so well in terms of generating new trade agreements. And so to keep the system moving forward in terms of lowering trade barriers, we need more bilateral agreements, and that will put pressure on other countries to join up. and you'll get sort of this wave of bilateral trade agreements that could help the multilateral system. And sort of ran out of steam by the late 2000s, primarily because Congress became more reluctant to support them. It was forcing a lot of trade policy votes, which in Congress, which most members of Congress don't like to do. The Democrats took over Congress, I believe, in 2006 or so. That put sort of a damper on what the Bush administration could do. But the idea, I think, is there's something to it, and you see what's going on today in terms of the European Union and Canada and Mexico. Even as the U.S. has stepped back from trade agreements to some extent, these other countries and regions are really moving forward and pushing forward with more and more trade agreements. I think there is this dynamic that's going on. As, for example, we see that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. pulls out of it, but the other countries that are party to it continue moving forward with not just that trade agreement, with other trade agreements with other countries as well. So I think there is something to the notion of competitive liberalization, and Mexico, Canada, EU, and others have really pushed forward on that.
So we've done plenty of shows about Obama trade policy, so I think we're going to skip forward to the present day. So in your book, you end on an ambiguous note, unwilling to commit whether or not the Trump era is going to presage a real paradigm shift on the level of the Civil War or post-Great Depression trade policy. But in a recent piece you've written in Foreign Affairs with a former ChinaEconTalk guest, Chad Bown, you declare that even if Trump loses in 2020, quote, global trade will never be the same. So what's the right way to think about Trump's current as well as potential future impact on U.S. as well as global trade policy?
Well, the reason why I was ambiguous in the book is because actually I finished the book in September of 2016 and sent it off to the publisher, fully expecting that I'd be dealing with President Hillary Clinton, and trade policy would be on no one's radar screen. No one would care about the issue at all, and the book would sink into oblivion and not receive any attention. So I did have a chance after the election just to write in 2 or 3 pages speculating about what a Trump administration might bring. So that I tried to make it as sort of, I'm not sure what to put. I tried to sort of just speculate about where the Trump administration might take trade policy, whether it would live up to the rhetoric or whether that was just overblown and not much would change. And I think in the piece with Chad that we wrote, sort of this 2.5 year assessment of the Trump administration in terms of trade policy. And I think they have introduced some really big changes that cannot be easily undone and that fundamentally shift where we are in terms of trade policy. So, one thing he's done is impose tariffs on imported steel. But we've had steel tariffs in the past. There are some exemptions to them, but also we've gotten rid of steel tariffs in the past. And so I think a new administration could say to repair a relationship with other countries and to help out our downstream manufacturers who depend on cheap imported inputs. We have to get rid of these steel tariffs. One can see that happening, and that sort of issue moves to the back burner. But the big one is China, of course. And there's where I think that what the Trump administration has done is much less reversible. By sort of imposing these tariffs on imports from China, it becomes very difficult for any future president to just get rid of those easily without reaching some sort of an agreement. And it's going to be very difficult to reach an agreement with China because what the U.S. essentially wants them to do is act like a market economy and open up and not have the government play such a large role. And of course, that's a fundamental contradiction in terms of where the Communist Party is coming from and the control it wants to have over the economy. So in some sense, I do see a more or less permanent medium-term breach between the U.S. and China that won't go away even with a new administration. Where some of the other things that we've had with trade friction with Mexico, trade friction with the EU, I think a new administration can easily repair those relationships.
We've gone through a lot of American history here. Any suggestions for budding scholars who want to take a deeper look into trade history, where they should dig, and what sorts of questions you think are particularly relevant today that are worth deeper exploration?
Well, I think there's so much out there and so much that's interesting. Obviously, a lot of historical parallels can be explored. A lot of particular, you can do some deep dives on some particular negotiations or some particular aspects of trade, both going way back to the colonial period and through the years since. One area I think that could be looked at more closely is looking at foreign archives in terms of how other countries have made adjustments to their trade policy, either in relation to the United States or just independently. So more of a sort of a global history of trade policies.
All right. After I get my my 7 languages down, we'll definitely take you up on that one. Any other final thoughts, Doug?
No, but except that it is amazing how there's sort of these cycles in terms of how important trade policy is in terms of American economic history, and it's sort of interesting to be present during this period now, when trade is so much in the headlines and in the news, even if the news isn't always good news.
Oh, to be alive in 2019. Doug Irwin, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
You're most welcome. Thank you.